So we're now ready to start talking about the nervous system, and the book breaks the nervous system up into 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12. And we're going here in chapter 10, we're going to be introduced to the structures and the function of the nervous system. And so we'll be looking at sort of overall structure of all of the cells of the nervous system. We're going to be looking at individual cells, so at the neurons specifically, and then the neuroglia as well. And then we'll wrap up by looking at exactly how it is that neurons are able to communicate. And so we've got a lot to do in this chapter. In this lecture, we're going to be looking mostly at the introductory materials. So as I mentioned, 2 types of cells that we find in the nervous system. Neurons, these are the communicating cells, and the neuroglia, these are the support cells, the ones that both physically support the neurons and also physiologically support the neurons. The nervous system is the primary master control and communication system in the body. It shares that function with the endocrine system, but the nervous system is the boss in a lot of ways. And the primary responsibility of the nervous system is to communicate with the body in order to maintain homeostasis. And it does this with 3 functions. There's a sensory function, gathering information, an integrative function, taking all this information that's gathered, making sense of it, and determining what the best response is. And then finally, the motor function, which is communicating out what needs to be done in order to maintain homeostasis in the body. So let's look first at the sensory function. That sensory function is all about monitoring changes in the internal and external environment. We talk about those changes as stimuli or stimulus. That's stimulus is singular, stimuli is plural. And we do this monitoring using structures that are talked about as sensory receptors. These are either specialized cells or groups of cells or even organs that are capable of responding when they notice changes in the environment. And that environment, again, could be either the internal environment of the body or something out there in the external environment. And so we talk about the information that the sensory receptors communicate back to the brain and to the spinal cord as sensory input. It's bringing information in. The integrative function is what happens in the brain and the spinal cord. And with integration, we process the sensory input, create sensations from it so that we can feel or sense, have the ability to make sense of it. Yeah, that doesn't help, does it? but a sensation is how we experience it, how our brain helps us to experience a piece of sensory input. It also includes storage and retrieval of information, so memories are involved in the integrative function. And then the last piece is to take that sensory input, take all this stored memory, and use it to make decisions about how best to respond to the stimulus. And so that it crafts the response, and last of all, we see the motor function. This is the carrying out the response, or sending out to the organs or cells that are going to carry out the response, the command. And we send those commands out to effector tissues. An effector is the cell or organ that produces the effect that will be the response to whatever the environmental stimulus was. And that sending that information, that command that we send out from the brain or the spinal cord, that is termed motor output. And the only effector tissues that we see in the body, there are 2 kinds of tissues, are muscles or glands. We can tell a muscle to contract or not to contract. And we can tell a gland to secrete or not to secrete. those are the only things that the brain and the spinal cord have control over. But, and to me, this is the part that is so exciting about the nervous system, is that with those two very basic kinds of commands, we have created the world that we live in. And, we're able to build buildings and grow food and write books and read books and perform plays, and that whole, our culture is the response. Is all about muscles contracting or glands secreting. Crazy to me. I love it. So we can organize the nervous system as we think about it. We can organize it into two major anatomical units: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, somehow my slides got out of order, so bear with me. I'm going to go first to the central nervous system. That's the brain and the spinal cord. It is all located within the dorsal cavity that we find running along the dorsal surface, and it's enclosed by and protected by the bones of the skull and the vertebral column. So we've seen these bones. And when we look at the brain, that's in the next chapter, we're going to see that the names of the lobes of the brains correspond nicely to the names of the bones that overlay them. So So the good news is there's the new words are going to be limited in a lot of ways, but that's all next chapter. This is where the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord are the integrating and command center of the nervous system, and it receives the sensory input, it interprets it, including creating sensations as appropriate, and then determines the appropriate response based on experiences, based on reflexes, and we're going to talk about reflexes in this chapter. Is that right? And maybe the next chapter. I think it's the next chapter. And then so it determines that response and sends it out there. And it's also the location of what we talk about as the higher functions of the brain. So that's intelligence, learning, emotions, memory, the executive function of the brain. There's also the peripheral nervous system. This is any part of the nervous system that's located outside the central nervous system. And it is responsible for communicating between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. So it carries sensory input toward the central nervous system, and it carries motor output away from the central nervous system. It's composed of nerves. These nerves are bundles of nerve fibers, the axons of neurons. So that's bundles of these axons that are wrapped up in connective tissue wrappings that isolate the individual axons from each other. And we have two sets of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. There are the cranial nerves, and we number them using Roman numerals 1 through 12. So this is the Roman numeral 1. Here's the Roman numeral 12. Again, we'll look at the names and the numbers when we get to the next chapter. And then there are the spinal nerves. There's 31 of them, and they exit the spinal cord in between the vertebra. So there's special channels that make space for the spinal nerves to be able to exit the spinal cord. All right, we're going to look now at the peripheral nervous system because there are there's a lot of ways that we can continue subdividing the peripheral nervous system. So there are two functional divisions. There's the sensory division, and there's the motor division. So the sensory division, this is afferent. So we have not encountered that term before. And when we see the opposite term to the afferent. It'll be a little easier probably for you to remember which is which. But afferent nerve fibers transmit impulses toward the central nervous system. So if the central nervous system is kind of the frame of reference, an afferent fiber would transmit information to that frame of reference, to the standard point. And it's along these sensory fibers that sensory input is taken to the central nervous system. So for instance, if you put your hand near a flame, then you would get that sensation of heat because of the communication that's being carried along these sensory fibers. Or if we're trying to maintain homeostasis around pH of the blood, then there are centers in the medulla oblongata that have sensory capability. Okay, so sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. And there is also a motor division. Now these are efferent. So if the sensory division is carrying, let's drop the brain. See if I can kind of, yeah, I'm not going to be a good artist here. But here's the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum. Here's the spinal cord come down. So if sensory information is headed toward the brain, then the motor division sends information back out to the body. And it's termed efferent because it is taking information to the effector tissues. So hopefully that is how you'll be able to remember this. We send information along efferent fibers that are taking division or that information to the effector tissues, telling them to either contract or not, or to secrete or not. So, for example, some of this motor output would include the commands to turn the pages in your book. Or if it's getting hot and in your house the heat's been on too long and you start to get warm, then we would send out motor commands to the sweat glands, telling them to produce a little sweat to cool you down. So the motor subdivision can be further subdivided into what is termed the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system of the motor division, also called the voluntary nervous system or the somatic motor division, these are the motor fibers that are transmitting impulses out to the effector tissues that are skeletal muscle. So we're sending out information to the skeletal muscles, telling them to contract or not to contract. And these, of course, are all the muscles that are under voluntary control. So you might decide, I'm thirsty, and so you lift your arm to drink from a glass, like I just did with my coffee. And then you also have all the swallowing muscles that are going to be, no, that wouldn't be voluntary. Most of those, yeah, they're voluntary. There we are. So all the swallowing muscles will then do their work to send the fluid down into the esophagus. So the somatic nervous system. And then there's the autonomic nervous system. And you'll see me use the abbreviation ANS regularly, just because autonomic nervous system gets so bored. I'm so bored with writing that. So we can also think of it as the involuntary nervous system or the visceral motor division. We'll see those names in just a second. Involuntary, well, because what we're transmitting impulses to are smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, all the involuntary muscles. And where do we find smooth and cardiac muscles? Well, we find them in the viscera of the organs of the ventral body cavities. So, for instance, as you're exercising, what are some things that happen in response to exercise? Well, one of them is that the heart rate is going to increase. If you get frightened because you're watching a scary movie, then the adrenal glands are probably going to release some epinephrine in response to that. So these are both involuntary responses. You cannot think your heart to beating more quickly. You cannot think your adrenal glands to release epinephrine. They happen involuntarily. And we see within the autonomic nervous system two functional divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So this is, thank goodness, the last of the levels. So if we, and we could even, I should have probably put up here that we're talking about the nervous system. So we could add one more layer here with the central nervous system. So central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system divided into sensory and motor divisions. Motor division divided into somatic and autonomic divisions. And then the autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. These are two functional divisions that work in opposition to each other. The sympathetic division is sometimes known as the fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system. And in general, it stimulates preparation of the body for action, to either stand your ground and duke it out with the grizzly bear that's coming to you, or, and probably the wiser path, to run like heck to escape that grizzly bear that's chasing you down. So when sympathetic fibers of the autonomic nervous system are stimulated, usually we generally see things that are going to prepare the body for action. So an increase in heart rate and force, more rapid respiration, dilation of the passageways, the bronchi of the lungs, so that we can get more oxygen into the lungs, pupil dilation, so that we can gather more visual information. And we turn off some of the functions that we don't need. You know, if you're running from a grizzly bear, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to put body resources toward digestion. You may not survive in order to digest the meal that you've eaten. So first job is to run like heck to get out of there, and then you can worry about digestion. And then the other division, the opposing division, is the parasympathetic. Para means alongside, so this is alongside the sympathetic division. And we think of this as the rest and digest system of the body. And in general, it calms the body down and helps, and we see stimulation instead now of the digestive and the excretory functions. So here we see that opposition to everything sympathetic, with a decrease in heart rate and force, a decrease in respiration, closing down, constriction of the bronchi, contraction of the pupils, and urination, the urge to urinate, or movements within the digestive tract. Those are all common characteristics, and lots of secretion of digestive juices that might be inhibited if the sympathetic division is in control. So parasympathetic and sympathetic working in opposition to each other. And the way that I remember which is I think about, this is the one where everything is opposite. They're working in opposition. It's also the naming feels opposite to me. I hear sympathetic and I usually think, how sweet and kind. I think of someone calming me when I'm upset. And this is opposite of that. Sympathetic is the preparing for action, and parasympathetic is the slowing down, the calming. And you may have experienced this. When I think about, try to remember what some of the effects are with each of these divisions, I think about playing hide and seek when I was a little kid. And, my brothers, say my oldest brother would be counting 1, 2, 3. And I would go into sympathetic division activities. I would be chasing myself from one place to another, trying to find the best hiding place. And I, looking here, is this a good one? I've got to run, I've got to hide. All those things that were all about sympathetic control. And as soon as I found my way to a good hiding space, I'm starting to calm down. parasympathetic control is starting to take over. And oh my gosh, I would be just like overwhelmed by the urge to wait for it. You're probably thinking, if you had the same experience, you will know exactly what it is, that once you're in that hiding place and start to calm down, oh my gosh, I'd have to pee like crazy. And that was because as parasympathetic control was taking back over, we're checking in and we're turning on all these functions that we had turned off while we were in sympathetic mode of hiding, running to hide. So maybe that'll help you. And again, sympathetic, that's the get you excited. Parasympathetic is the calm you down. Okay, so there you have it. We've looked at, just put names out there for the kinds of cells that we find in the nervous system, and then begun sort of the naming of the different functional portions of the nervous system: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system further subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, and the autonomic nervous system further subdivided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, study well. You know how to reach me if you have any questions.